5 years ago, at the age of 34, stuntman Tim Lawrence was told he had Parkinson's disease, a condition that is slowly freezing his body but has left his mind intact. 3 years ago, Tim found an unusual way of relieving his symptoms. The trouble is, it involves a street drug, which is illegal and dangerous. This is the story of how one man's discovery could overturn 30 years of scientific thought and might eventually lead to an entirely new treatment for Parkinson's.
The first time I ever noticed that something was amiss was I was getting onto a bus and I found that I couldn't manipulate my left thumb very well. I just paid with my right and thought no more of it. But from that point, my left arm started to lose some of its mobility. Then my left leg started to get the same degree of laziness and slowness to it. I can remember saying to friends and people around me that if I could get a name for what this is, then I'd know what to fight. I went to see a consultant, and I can remember having to make a half-hour journey back to my mum's flat and just blinking back tears and just reeling in shock because I'd got a name, but in my mind I was going, but no, I didn't want that name. My whole image of Parkinson's disease at that point was just the received image that most of us get, which is just of elderly people having great difficulty dealing with cups of tea, and funnily enough, elderly people always offered cups of tea on saucers. But anyway, so my whole world just dropped out.
Tim Lawrence was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1994. It's a condition which slowly freezes the body.
Yeah?
1 in 500 of us is destined to get Parkinson's, probably in our 60s, but occasionally much younger. And when it hits the young, it can be especially aggressive. Tim is prescribed drugs to unlock his limbs. But these drugs often produce distressing side effects, twitching movements for which there is little treatment. Science has tried for years to find better drugs, but it has failed. As yet, there is no cure for Parkinson's.
You can make it 5% of your life or 95% of your life. You choose. And then, of course, there's things that you have to adjust to, and job changes you have to do, and jobs you realise that you'll never be able to do, like bomb disposal.
The guy I first met, I was 17, and this was the coolest guy to be around because, we'd be in Bayswater in a shopping mall, and Tim would be there, walking down the aisles on his hands. And when he'd finished that, he'd be, juggling the baked bean cans or doing Monty Python sketches at the till and making everyone laugh, and constantly, had this aura about him that was this incredibly physical, funny, inspired and exciting person. And that was Tim.
Tim worked as a stunt performer for 10 years, on the film Braveheart and other Hollywood movies, and on TV shows such as London's Burning. Acrobatics, martial arts and skydiving were also part of a very active life. Today, there are times when Tim can barely move. The drugs that make him mobile sometimes don't work, and when they don't, it exposes the raw symptoms of his condition. This is Parkinson's disease: rigidity, slowness of movement, and tremor.
Everything in the body will start getting heavier and heavier and heavier. Eyelids, vocal cords, tongue, everything just goes really heavy. It's like every cell in the body has just had a dead horse attached to it.
What is making Tim feel so weighed down is not a problem in his body, but in his brain. Tim is missing a vital brain chemical, a chemical called dopamine. Inside one tiny part of his brain, the cells which make dopamine are dying. Without dopamine, Tim is becoming paralyzed because it is dopamine that triggers the whole chain reaction in the brain which tells the body how to move. "30 years ago, there was no effective treatment for Parkinson's disease. Victims were trapped, frozen in bodies which could no longer move. But in the late 1960s, science found a way to restore the lost dopamine with a synthetic chemical equivalent taken in the form of a drug. It was called Levodopa, or L-Dopa for short, and it was hailed as a miracle.
The introduction of L-Dopa was just an absolute revolution. People who had been bedbound for years suddenly were able to get up and walk. They had control of their lives back. They had mobility. They were able to become integrated back into society. And it really is the sort of discovery, the sort of revolution that has affected the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people worldwide.
For a while, L-Dopa magically unfroze Tim too, replacing the lost dopamine in his brain and helping him move normally again.
When I first went on to L-Dopa, the first few months of being on it are just brilliant. You just get all this movement back again.
For a time, L-Dopa kicked Tim's system back to normal. But just 4 years after starting on the drug, there are serious side effects.
Ooh, kicking in.
This is what happens when Tim takes L-Dopa today. The drug still gives him mobility, but his movements are no longer normal.
The real problem is that later in the illness, the drugs don't work as well as they used to in the early stages. And one of the common side effects is, unfortunately, the introduction of involuntary movements. So they're mobile, but in fact they have movement that they can't control. They will get twisting of their limbs and their bodies. And our problem is that we can make them mobile, but they then have a degree of mobility which is of little use to them.
This is known as Dyskinesias, which is it's to do with the fact that the chemical dopamine that I'm given is not as subtle as the dopamine that the body itself produces. Whereas normally one could talk and pour liquid out, for example, for me to do that and focus on if I'm experiencing this involuntary movement, I would have to go silent, because even the process of talking is using muscles, vocal cords. These are all demands on the system, really.
Tim can spend half his waking hours twitching uncontrollably, and no one knows quite why the drug has this effect. It is thought that after a while, the brain cannot cope with the way in which L-Dopa floods it with dopamine. In a healthy person, natural dopamine is released in tune with the body's needs. It is a devastating side effect, which often appears most severely in young Parkinsons, and young people can face decades on L-Dopa. That's why scientists are so anxious to find something new.
I've had a friend's 5-year-old daughter asking her mum, "Why's Timmy dancing?" To which my response was, "I've got my own internal rhythm, freeform jazz." I've had another friend's son, every time I'd see him, he'd come back with more ingenious ways of keeping me still. Nailing me down, sellotaping me to the chair. "How about if I hold you really tightly?" And it used to get quite inventive. And I used to be known as Wiggling Tim. It is something, though, when you have 65-year-old women helping you with your shopping. You do start to see how flexible this thing pride is.
Few people realise just how many young people there are with Parkinson's, many of whom will have to cope with the side effects of L-Dopa for years. There's long been a need to find something better for them.
I mean, we might ask, how old were you when you got the illness?
I was 36 when I was diagnosed.
Diagnosed at age of 34?
Yes, I was 32 just.
Yeah, I was 27.
You see, I mean, this is absolutely sort of classical, and it's not.
In the UK alone, there are 7,000 to 8,000 young sufferers.
We have a general concept of what causes the illness, but beyond that, we're still really grasping at straws.
There is still no consensus about what causes Parkinson's. Head trauma, viruses, faulty genes and toxins in the environment have all been suggested, but not proved. But what is known is that those who get it when they're young can get it very badly.
Often their disease appears to be very much more aggressive than the form of illness which is shown by older individuals. The progression of the illness is more rapid, their response to drug treatment is lost more quickly, and they also, unfortunately, will develop many of the long-term side effects of therapy, such as the involuntary movements, very much more rapidly than you would see in an elderly population.
Then I had a re-equip which was supposed to replace it.
Without L-Dopa, they cannot move. With L-Dopa, many will become disabled through too much movement. And there is yet another problem. The drug sometimes stops working altogether, leaving them completely paralysed. It is a particular issue for young people, as they have to live with Parkinson's for many years. For 30 years, science has struggled to find a replacement for L-Dopa, or something that makes it work better. And most of this work has been focused on the belief that dopamine is the sole key to treating Parkinson's. Dozens of new compounds which affect dopamine levels in the brain have been tried. Some work in some patients. But to date, science has failed to come up with anything that is better than L-Dopa, or which calms its terrible side effects. Which makes Tim Lawrence's story extraordinary. For Tim seems to have stumbled by accident on a drug which tames the involuntary movements caused by L-Dopa. It's a drug which has never been tried in Parkinson's before, indeed in the treatment of any physical illness. But it is a drug which has been part of Tim's life as a young person.
Do you think if
think those kind of details are
Coming out in the open about his discovery could lead to a completely new approach to the treatment of Parkinson's.
3 to 4 years ago, I was in this club with some friends, and I was just suddenly aware that all these dyskinetic movements, I was just suddenly aware that everything was completely smooth, as though I never had the disease in the first place.
The drug Tim took was ecstasy, or MDMA.
I remember one particular time at Glastonbury, it was about 2 foot deep in mud, and he was having a really hard time. And this ecstasy kicked in with him. And I noticed the mobility. I'd often seen it, but this time it really hit me. He started ploughing through this mud and charging ahead and dancing and coordinating himself really well.
We take risks every day of our life. It is illegal, but there's not really a punishment out there that could match what I actually go through myself on a day-to-day basis.
Within an hour and a half of taking ecstasy in combination with Levodopa, Tim is transformed. Not quite into the stuntman he once was, but into someone confident enough to tackle moves he hasn't tried for 6 years. What you're about to see, according to conventional science, is impossible.
Today, Matthew, I'm going to be Olga Corbett. Great. Brilliant. Just to feel that fluidity of movement again. Everything you tell your body to do, it more or less does. It's complete symmetry and fluidity of movement. It's just an amazing, liberating feeling. I couldn't have done this without being on ecstasy, because my coordination would have been impaired. I may have had the strength to do it, but the signals would have been erratic.
Tim's discovery is all the more extraordinary because no one has ever thought ecstasy could help someone with Parkinson's. But despite the liberating qualities of ecstasy for Tim, he knows the drug is not a practical solution for him in its current form. He takes it mainly when he goes out clubbing, at most twice a month.
I wouldn't want to feel like that all day, every day. It's an unreal state, and because of its unreality, it's to be enjoyed as a novelty. I wouldn't like to function every day on it.
The dangers of ecstasy are now well documented. It is rarely fatal, but those who take the illegal drug do risk serious long-term harm. It can cause memory blackouts and depression, and research suggests the drug may be especially damaging to people with Parkinson's. The big question is, might there be a way to adapt ecstasy into something that Tim and others with Parkinson's could safely take every day? Shown the footage of Tim at the gym scientists at Hammersmith Hospital were keen to find out more.
Well, like a lot of young onset cases, Tim has got an aggressive form of the disease. In 7 or 8 years, he's now reached the stage where he's having severe involuntary movements, dyskinesias, on levels of medication that are required to keep him mobile. One of the major problems that we're facing in the clinic is that there are no good drugs to combat this situation. Tim inadvertently has discovered that ecstasy seems to work very well for him, which is fascinating, and we need to find out why that is.
The reason Professor Brooks is intrigued is because ecstasy is thought to cause virtually no increase in the levels of dopamine, the brain chemical Tim is missing, and certainly not enough to have any effect on movement.
Can you sit down?
In fact, the main effect of ecstasy is to cause a massive release in the brain of a completely different brain chemical, serotonin.
I'm 39.
Both dopamine and serotonin are brain chemicals known as neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals which relay messages between the brain's 10 billion nerve cells, telling us how to feel, move, and react. There are at least 300 different neurotransmitters, and each of these chemicals carry different types of messages between the brain and the body. Dopamine, as we've seen, is the critical chemical that kickstarts movement. That's why its loss in Parkinson's has become such a focus for science. High levels of serotonin, which occur when you take ecstasy, make you feel happy, euphoric. Serotonin is not thought by scientists to have anything to do with movement. Professor Brooks decided to run a series of special tests. Tim's discovery might just be the breakthrough everyone in Parkinson's has been hoping for. So finding out how ecstasy is working in Tim is vital.
What we thought we might do, Tim, is get you to have 2 scans with a tracer called raclopride, which measures the levels of dopamine in the brain, and we'd ask you to have 1 scan when you're not taking any medication,
Right.
and then a 2nd scan after you take some of your ecstasy, just to see whether that is producing a release of dopamine and giving you the benefits you experience.
Tim will be injected with a radioactive marker and then scanned to reveal if ecstasy is somehow causing a release of dopamine in his brain, as the doctors suspect must be the case.
Let's get this bit in. It's designed by Americans, so it doesn't work that way. How you doing?
So as not to confuse the tests, Tim has cleared his body of L-Dopa.
And the lights are going down, Timothy.
For the first 90-minute scan, Tim takes no drugs at all, and his body reverts to the rigid and immobile state of untreated Parkinson's. The following day, for the 2nd scan, Tim again takes no L-Dopa, but this time took an ecstasy tablet before he arrived at the hospital. Tim has never taken ecstasy without L-Dopa before, and the first big surprise is revealed as Tim emerges from the scanner.
Just swing your legs over the side, just sit on the side. Just have a rest there.
After the 2nd scan, on the right, Tim is more mobile. Ecstasy alone has unfrozen his limbs.
Now then, can you try wriggling your toe?
Go on. You bear with me, you come towards me. I'll put you down to the left. You all right?
The drug does not give him nearly as much mobility as when it is taken in conjunction with L-Dopa, but that it gives him any movement is surprising.
Okay, now, do you just do the finger tap, you do quicker than that?
Until now, no one thought ecstasy alone could ease the paralysing effects of Parkinson's.
Can you do it together?
And then comes the biggest surprise of all. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter that the entire medical profession believed was the key to treating Parkinson's, seems to be playing no part in the unfreezing process.
It's not at all clear why MDMA, or ecstasy as it's known, should help his involuntary movement so effectively. There were two possibilities. One is that it might be stimulating his natural dopamine in some way that helped the situation. The other is that it might be working by a completely different route by acting on other chemical receptors. If one looks at his scans on the screen here, one can see the dopamine binding sites in the centre of his brain before and after he took his ecstasy. And really there has been very little change, a few % difference. So he is releasing very little dopamine, because he doesn't have much, having Parkinson's, after he takes his ecstasy. So the mechanism of action of the ecstasy must be via a different neurotransmitter system. And so we're very keen now to try and find out what that system is. It may be that we can find a drug that would act on that and help Tim, but be potentially far less harmful to him in the long term than taking ecstasy.
Tim, it seems, really has stumbled on something new. The question now is, can science take it any further? David Brooks suggested that two scientists at Manchester University, Professor Alan Crossman and Dr. John Brochi, might have the answer. Professor Brooks knew they'd be interested in Tim's case because for the past 15 years, these scientists have been trying to prove to the world that it is possible to treat Parkinson's with something other than dopamine. Their mission started when Alan Crossman noticed that dyskinesias, the involuntary movements caused by L-Dopa in patients like Tim, bore an uncanny resemblance to an extremely rare condition called hemibalism. This is hemibalism, and it is not caused by anything to do with dopamine.
Hemibalism is a fascinating condition characterized by wild, flailing movements, throwing movements. It was known to be caused by a small lesion, a destruction of a tiny region of the brain called the subthalamic nucleus. This is a little group of nerve cells about the size of half a peanut.
The subthalamic nucleus sits here, deep in the brain. It is close to the key area where dopamine is produced. But there is no direct connection between these two structures, and until Alan Crossman came along, no one thought the subthalamic nucleus was involved in Parkinson's. No one knew this tiny area of the brain might offer a whole new way of treating the illness.
The subthalamic nucleus was regarded as nothing more than a neurological curiosity. The only significance that it appeared to have in brain function was that once in a blue moon somebody had a stroke in this region, and the consequence was that they had these exuberant abnormal movements, hemibalism. That was its only function. The only function was to prevent you having hemibalism. There was no other purpose for its existence.
Intrigued by the similarity between hemibalism and the dyskinesias suffered by patients like Tim, Crossman studied the subthalamic nucleus to see if it might also be involved in Parkinson's. It was something no one had ever considered before, and what Crossman discovered amazed him. The subthalamic nucleus in the Parkinson's brain was hyperactive, quite different than in a normal brain. It meant this tiny nucleus clearly was involved in Parkinson's. It was a revelation. Until this point, everyone in Parkinson's research had been focused on dopamine and the area in the brain which produced it. But Crossman had found the first direct evidence that a completely different structure, the subthalamic nucleus, which had no direct connection with dopamine, played a crucial role in Parkinson's too. It was a discovery that has led directly to a new technique to treat those in whom the side effects from L-Dopa have become intolerable. Not a new drug, but surgery.
Okay.
This operation is graphic proof of Crossman's discovery that the subthalamic nucleus plays a vital role in Parkinson's. And it shows that it is possible to control the illness by manipulating this area of the brain.
Okay. Okay.
Is that okay now? That's very painful.
Neurosurgeon Steve Gill is going to place an electrode in the subthalamic nucleus of 36-year-old Simon Burrell, who has had Parkinson's for 13 years.
What's throbbing?
If all goes to plan, the surgery should alleviate his Parkinson's symptoms. But it is risky, and it doesn't always work. Sometimes it leaves patients with depression, speech problems, or blurred vision. It can even paralyze or kill.
It's taken 45 minutes. It's deviating left. Okay.
To provide vital feedback, the patient must be awake and has been off all medication for 24 hours to expose his raw Parkinson's. At the moment, he is frozen. If the surgeon hits the right place in the subthalamic nucleus, Simon will be able to move again. The surgeon advances the probe millimetre by millimetre. And then...
Hold your right hand up and do some big movements, big duck movements.
Big as you can.
Really wide.
It's an impact effect again, just straight into the nucleus. Good.
How does it feel?
Stable from there on.
Absolutely brilliant. That's fantastic, Simon. Well done. That has gone really well. It's doing very, very well, Simon. With your right foot, big movements.
This surgery can improve symptoms by up to 70%, for a while at least. It is not a cure, and it remains a last resort. Because of the high risk, Tim is not prepared to undergo this surgery.
This is something I never thought I'd be using. It's a sort of adult Tommy Tippy. I don't know, something that they'd use so they wouldn't spill when they're going up the north face of the Matterhorn.
It is acknowledged that a new treatment, less risky than surgery, is needed desperately. And that's why Tim's discovery about ecstasy could be so important.
Yeah, haven't you ever noticed that subthalamic nucleus?
Alan Crossman's early work, showing the subthalamic nucleus was key in Parkinson's, was to change everything. It prompted the Manchester team to hunt for a drug which could help patients like Tim. A drug which could do the same as surgery, but be far less dangerous. John Brochi, a pharmacologist, knew that if he could find out which neurotransmitter was operating in the subthalamic nucleus, there might be a way to manipulate it with a drug which, like ecstasy, would bypass the dopamine route. But there are more than 300 different neurotransmitters in the brain, and there was no existing technique sensitive enough to show which one was operating in such a small part of it.
I mean, the big problem is that the subthalamic nucleus is very, very small, and so it's that big. And so you can't use some of the techniques that you might use if you were looking at connections between two big pieces of brain.
It took Brochi 2 painstaking years to devise a method he hoped would reveal which crucial neurotransmitter was controlling the subthalamic nucleus. Finally, he discovered a way to do it. Brochi took tiny samples of brain tissue and broke them down into individual cells. The cells were then bathed in radioactive markers which would stick only to specific neurotransmitters. Once the cells were separated back out, the radioactive markers for each neurotransmitter could be counted. And this revealed that the neurotransmitter which controlled the subthalamic nucleus was one called glutamate. It soon became clear that a compound which controlled glutamate did have a small effect on Parkinson's. And this was a major breakthrough, because it established the principle that it was possible to treat the illness with a new type of drug which had nothing to do with dopamine.
It was quite a surprise to most of the other people in the field at the time, because there really had been this dogma that the only way of treating Parkinson's disease was by putting dopamine back.
But they needed something better than glutamate. So the Manchester team began looking for receptors for all the neurotransmitters operating in the area of the brain which controls movement. There turned out to be dozens, and eventually they discovered that one of them was serotonin, the neurotransmitter that floods Tim's brain when he takes ecstasy. It was a real hint that serotonin could be involved in movement after all, and more proof soon followed.
We did an experiment where we looked at the levels of this receptor in the brains of Parkinsonian patients who had died with very severe L-dopa-induced dyskinesias. What we found was that this receptor was dramatically increased in its numbers, so suggesting that serotonin was actually one of the key components of the process that actually leads to the generation of dyskinesia.
It confirmed that serotonin probably was involved in Parkinson's. The Manchester team was intrigued, but they were still years away from proving that a drug which affected serotonin could actually work in someone with Parkinson's. It was still just a theory. And then they heard about Tim Lawrence and his experience with ecstasy.
While we like to think that we all do logically designed experiments based on real scientific logical reasons for going forward, very often it's the unexpected that opens new doors and allows new impetus to come into science and propels us forward.
Tim appears to be living proof of the Manchester findings, but while fascinating to science, his is only one man's experience. Before any scientist could commit time and resources to developing a drug based on the properties of ecstasy, they would need to be more confident that the effect on Tim is real and not something called the placebo effect.
It's just...
It may sound extraordinary, but the belief that a pill will do you good can sometimes result in a genuine physical improvement which has nothing to do with the drug itself. It's caused by the brain deceiving the body. One placebo study in the US revealed that patients who took sugar pills believing they were antidepressants showed almost as much improvement in their condition as those who took the real thing.
The placebo effect is very, very powerful, and it's one of the major factors that needs to be taken into account when determining whether a drug works or not. For instance, in Parkinson's disease, up to 30% of the anti-Parkinsonian action of the drugs that are currently available actually just comes from the fact that the patients are taking a tablet every day. As a scientist, that's the question I would like answered before we know whether this is real and worth pursuing further.
Tim volunteers to take part in an independent 2-day trial. On both days he will be given L-dopa, but only on one day will he take ecstasy. On the other he will take a simple sugar pill. Before the tests start, Tim again has to clear his body of all medication. Once more it reveals how, without drugs, Parkinson's freezes his limbs. Tim is monitored throughout by neurologist Dr. Susan Fox, a specialist in movement disorders. The whole test is recorded on video, which Crossman and Brochi agreed to assess.
Right, can you try and do that for me?
For the Manchester team, it could provide the evidence that there is something genuinely worth pursuing. For Tim, it is a moment of truth. Is the effect of ecstasy all the work of his imagination, or has he really discovered something new?
Morning, Tim. You clearly haven't had any of your medication this morning. How are you feeling?
Reserved.
Right. Do you feel quite stiff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On both days, Tim takes a tablet. On one day, it is the simple sugar pill. The other day, it is ecstasy, but they look identical. No one, including the film crew, Dr. Fox or Tim, knows which is which.
Try and open and close your hand.
Before the drug has a chance to work, Dr. Fox assesses Tim's raw Parkinson's. On both days, he is slow and rigid, particularly on his left side, which is the most affected.
He's got major trouble on his left side.
There you go, Tim. That's some Levodopa, if you'd like to take that.
Then, at the same time each day, Dr. Fox gives Tim some L-Dopa. The clock is set to 0, marking the official start of the test. 20 minutes later, there is the first sign of a difference between the 2 days. On day 2, on the right, he can already lift his left arm and pick up the mug smoothly.
That's much more fluent on his mostly Parkinsonian side, yeah. Greatly different, much more smooth movement.
90 minutes into the test, the L-Dopa that Tim took on both days has kicked in, but nonetheless, it is affecting Tim quite differently. On day 1, he is mobile, but has dyskinesia. On day 2, he is also mobile, but appears to have almost no dyskinesia.
If that was replicated in him the next time he tried it, would be clinically significant, because you've actually changed that guy's ability to perform some pretty important tasks, you know.
After 2¼ hours on day 1, the effect of the L-Dopa has worn off, and Tim has returned to his untreated Parkinsonian state. But after the same amount of time on day 2, he is still mobile and moving smoothly. The difference is particularly marked when Tim is asked to put on a jacket.
Have a go.
No, I can't.
You can't, okay. Tim, put your coat on and zip it up.
Was the best thing I've ever seen in a patient. I mean, the best difference, yeah? Honestly, I think that is, you're not going to show me anything that's better than that. I don't think so, that was brilliant.
On day 2, a further 20 minutes later, Tim is still mobile and fluid. By the end of the test, Tim has stayed mobile for 30% longer than on day 1, with almost no dyskinesia. By now, Tim himself has realised he has taken ecstasy because of the effect on his mood. It was later confirmed that it was indeed on day 2 that he took ecstasy.
The reason that we're interested and excited by this is that we've spent the last, well, should we say how many years? I don't know, between us, probably between us, best part of 50 years, trying to understand dyskinesia and movement disorders generally. And the effect that we see here is probably one of the biggest effects I've ever seen. We've been involved with several clinical trials for potential drugs that you could add to levodopa, and I've not seen a patient who has shown such a big difference on 2 films.
Walk back and forwards.
It is, as I said, one of the most interesting pieces of footage I've seen, with a potential to develop completely new drugs for Parkinson's disease.
News of the outcome of the placebo test reaches the Parkinson's Disease Society, the national charity which supports the 120,000 people in the UK who have the illness.
The Society, of course, has to say, quite properly, quite understandably, that it absolutely cannot condone in any way the taking of an illegal substance, no matter what it can do. But actually there's a lot more in here for the Society, because the Society, I believe, has a moral obligation to ensure that some research follows Tim's experience, because there just may be, in his experience, a clue, a vital clue, that is going to help us find a way forward in the better management of Parkinson's disease.
The Tim stories really increased my faith that we can develop a serotonin-based therapy for Parkinson's disease. Although, of course, we can't condone what he did and he shouldn't have been taking the drug. He's given us a clue, I think that's fair to say. And that's a clue that we really can't overlook if we're going to push forward and make the lives of patients with Parkinson's disease better.
Tim's experience has helped convince the Manchester team that it is worth dedicating time and money to teasing out exactly how ecstasy works in Tim. But it won't be by working with the drug itself.
We're not going to be using ecstasy for the research. We're going to be looking at experimental compounds which mimic individual actions of ecstasy. We don't want to use ecstasy. It's going to have too many side effects to be a realistic treatment. If we can dissect out the pharmacology, then we can take, if you like, the good out of ecstasy without the bad, and actually develop a treatment based around that.
You really cannot ignore what has happened to Tim. You cannot dismiss it just because it's illegal. Life isn't like that. Life is complicated. It's not about black and white issues. It's about many varying shades of grey. And I think there is evidence here which needs to be followed up for the sake of the people living with this extremely challenging illness.
Tim's experience is intriguing, but without proper research there must be caution. That ecstasy works for him doesn't necessarily mean it could be developed into a useful treatment for others. And there is worry about the long-term damage Tim could be doing to himself by taking ecstasy. There is now evidence that the drug may be destroying what little natural dopamine he has left in his brain. Many believe that ecstasy could cause great long-term harm to anyone with Parkinson's.
I can understand fully why Tim resorts to ecstasy, because basically classical medicine has failed him. But is he damaging himself further for the future? We know ecstasy in recreational doses can be toxic to remaining dopaminergic neurons. There's some excellent science being done in this area. And what I would hate to happen to Tim is that, in fact, by having short-term relief of his involuntary movements, he is producing a worse outcome as far as his Parkinson's disease is concerned, and that his rate of progression might be enhanced.
The 10:58 to Manchester Piccadilly, now boarding at platform 13, calling at Milton Keynes.
Tim has now offered to go to Manchester to help with further research.
This whole experience has been incredible and quite a journey. I certainly would never have thought that I'd be having the medical academia looking over me and interested in something that I just used to look upon as a recreational thing of a night out. If something could be developed from this that could be used on a daily basis, the change that would have in my life, if something like that was available on the market, would be... I think it would be pretty much total.
If you have been affected by tonight's programme and would like information or details of organisations that can offer you support and advice, then call the BBC Action Line on 0800 077 077.